My name is Danielle Crawford, and I'm from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Today, my talk is titled Literary Studies and the Geography of Climate Change Towards a Transpacific Network of Disaster. While climate change is now becoming visible in U.S. public policy, its uneven impact is often unaddressed. Poor countries from the global south that have contributed the least to greenhouse gas emissions are projected to be the most severely impacted. This unequal distribution has led to the emergence of a quote-unquote climate change winner argument in U.S. policy discourse. This argument, as defined by Jody Freeman and Andrew Guzman, posits, quote, climate change as a collective action problem wherein the best American policy would be to free ride on the efforts of more significantly affected states, end quote. Freeman and Guzman adeptly use climate change studies and cost-benefit analyses to thoroughly debunk this argument on its own terms, exposing an inherent flaw in the assumption that the United States will not be significantly impacted by climate change. Building from their argument, it is crucial to further consider the moral dimensions, or lack thereof, behind this quote-unquote climate change winner stance. While U.S. cost-benefit analyses situate climate change policy within a framework of national monetary gain or loss, they fail to account for the role the United States has played as a colossal contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, as well as the planetary scope of climate change itself, especially its impact across national paradigms. Addressing climate change through a transnational context of environmental justice, one that acknowledges the socio-cultural disparity of its impact and challenges the national moorings of its policies, is thus crucial and is a context through which the humanities can intervene in climate and environmental studies. In particular, disaster is a key arena wherein literary studies can contribute to our understanding of climate change. While disaster is often materially connected to climate change, it also has a material presence in many literary works. I argue that a Transpacific approach to disaster literature, one which accounts for movements and exchanges across the Pacific, can help us move beyond restrictive national frameworks that dictate climate change discourse and policy. This paper traces a network of disaster in two texts based in Asia and the Pacific, Arzamor Lindmark's Leche and Juliet Kono's Tsunami Years. Tracing the various disasters embedded in this novel and poetry collection reveals both the inherent vulnerability of specific sites as well as the broad reach of a wide range of disasters and their implications within a warming planet. The Transpacific Network of Disaster ultimately highlights the need to reassess the geography of climate change and the atmospheric and oceanic processes that cannot be contained within national borders. Before delving into Lindmark's and Kono's works, it is first necessary to define a Transpacific framework and its significance for a literary analysis of climate change. Aaron Suzuki asserts that the term Transpacific has been, quote, broadly used to describe the routes and infrastructures that enable the movements of peoples and goods across and around the Pacific, as in the case of shipping and trade routes. However, Suzuki moves away from this generic usage of the term and instead resituates the Transpacific within Asian American literary and cultural studies, positing it as a critical framework that encompasses circulations of cultures and communities throughout Asia and the Pacific, as well as particular infrastructures of empire in the region, such as tourism and militarism. Moreover, Suzuki uses the Transpacific to highlight, quote, the vast ecological networks that are shaped by, yet also operate independently of human agency, end quote. This paper builds from Suzuki's Transpacific ecological network in order to ultimately highlight a Transpacific network of disaster, wherein disasters and the processes of climate change are situated within an ecologically interconnected Pacific. This Transpacific network is useful for climate change studies because it highlights the inherent mobility of disaster and climate change processes, showcasing their tendencies to move across national border. Disasters, and particularly storm systems, are often transnational entities in and of themselves. An example of this is Super Typhoon Yolanda, internationally known as Haiyan, which hit the Philippines in November 2013. Before this Category 5 typhoon hit the Philippine islands of Leyte and Samar, it started as a low-pressure system in Micronesia. This system eventually developed into a super typhoon, the eye of which moved over Palau before landing in Samar and devastating the Visayas region of the Philippines. NASA satellites show that Yolanda eventually weakened as it left the Philippine area of responsibility, making a second landfall in Vietnam and China, where it finally dissipated. While the storm trajectory of Yolanda clearly followed a Transpacific route, this is not to say that the storm's damage was evenly dispersed. The destructive impact of Yolanda was staggeringly concentrated in the Philippines, resulting in the deaths of over 6,000 people in the archipelago, with over 1,000 people still missing. It is thus important to remember that a Trans-Pacific network of disaster does not entail universalizing the effects of climate change across the Pacific. Rather, tracing a literary network of disasters, ranging from storms and volcanic eruptions to tsunamis, is a means to acknowledge disparities and differing vulnerabilities throughout Asia and the Pacific, while also challenging the myopic national frameworks used to address climate change. R. Zamora Lindmark's novel Leche provides a clear example of this twofold purpose of a Trans-Pacific network of disaster, as the text highlights both the vulnerability of the Philippines to specific disasters, as well as their Trans-Pacific impact. The novel follows protagonist Vince de los Reyes as he travels to the Philippines, the country of his birth, after living in Hawaii for 13 years. In this sense, Zamora's novel can be considered a Trans-Pacific text in and of itself, one which draws connections across the Pacific, and specifically between the Philippines and Hawaii. Vince's accounts of his travels from Honolulu to Manila are interspersed with images of postcards sent back to friends and family in Hawaii, as well as quote-unquote tourist tips or bulleted lists of advice for the anonymous traveler planning to visit Manila. One of these tourist tips states, quote, "Do not bring a raincoat unless you're traveling during the typhoon months from June to November. If that's the case, bring a life vest and an inflatable kayak," end quote. This tip cleverly points to the intensity of typhoon season and the severity of urban floods in the Philippines, where makeshift rafts and boats are indeed used to navigate streets. While typhoons are a seasonal component of weather in the Philippines, their severity and frequency are expected to increase with the progression of climate change, as noted by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, hereafter referred to as the IPCC. The scientific contributors to the IPCC's 2014 synthesis report write that, quote, "Extreme precipitation events over most of the mid-latitude land masses and over wet tropical regions will very likely become more intense and more frequent," end quote. This particular moment in Lindmark's text thus highlights the vulnerability of the Philippines to destructive storm systems, a vulnerability that can be linked to the growing risks of a changing climate. While Leche accounts for typhoon season in the Philippines, the novel also describes the impending eruption of Mount Pinatubo. In a postcard to his friend in Honolulu, Vince writes, quote, "It's confirmed. Mount Pinatubo, a volcano near here, has awakened. Minor quakes for now, but it's being closely monitored. It's near Clark Air Force Base and Angeles City," end quote. The Pinatubo eruption occurred in 1991 and was the second largest eruption of the 20th century, resulting in approximately 800 deaths. It had a global impact on the planet's climate, quote, "causing temperatures to drop and Asian rain patterns to shift temporarily," end quote. Drawing from the research of Stephen Self and co-authors, Wynne Perry notes that the eruption generated a cloud 684 miles wide and 22 miles high that carried, quote, "about 17 megatons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere," end quote. This sulfur dioxide turned into aerosols of sulfuric acid, which, quote, "spread around the globe in about 3 weeks and ultimately caused a dramatic decrease in the amount of solar energy reaching the planet," end quote. While such volcanic eruptions cause the global climate to change temporarily, the link between human-induced climate change and volcanic eruptions is still unclear. Nonetheless, the global circulation of sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere can be read as analogous to the global circulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, as both processes move beyond and across national borders. The Pinatubo eruption also had a Trans-Pacific impact on the infrastructure of the U.S. military-industrial complex in Asia and the Pacific, as the damage from this eruption was exacerbated by the simultaneous occurrence of Typhoon Didang, internationally known as Typhoon Nunya. The duo of the typhoon and eruption created vast amounts of soaked volcanic ash and debris that rendered the United States Clark Air Base unusable and severely damaged Subic Naval Base. Bruce Cummings asserts that the eruption, quote, "combined with the recent Democratic Revolution, or the 1986 People Power Revolution, to force the United States out of the Philippines, where it deployed many bases for almost a century," end quote. In Lindmark's novel, Vince witnesses this evacuation of the U.S. military from Clark Air Base while on a lengthy bus ride to his home province of San Vicente. As the bus stops to let an enormous convoy of U.S. military vehicles pass through, the protagonist observes the conversation of his fellow passengers regarding the base evacuations. Quote, "Mommy, why are the American soldiers leaving us?" Vince hears a boy ask his mother. "Because," the boy's mother pauses to think, "they're running away from the volcano," end quote. While this movement highlights the Transpacific infrastructure of the U.S. military-industrial complex, it can also be understood as reflective of the threat that disasters, and by extension climate change, pose to the operation of U.S. military bases. The mother's comment that the U.S. soldiers are, quote, running away from the volcano is indicative of the U.S. military's vulnerability to ecological forces and atmospheric processes. Although the military is responding to a volcanic eruption here, their response is nonetheless reflective of the DoD's growing concern with climate change, which the Pentagon views as a quote-unquote security risk on a global scale. The remainder of this paper focuses on the depiction of Pacific tsunamis in Juliette Kono's tsunami years. While at first glance, tsunamis may not seem directly related to climate change, rising sea levels do in fact affect tsunami severity and have the potential to expand tsunami inundation areas further inland. The IPCC's 2014 synthesis report asserts with high confidence that, quote, over the period 1901 to 2010, global mean sea level rose by 0.19 meters, and that the rate of sea level rise since the mid-19th century has been larger than the mean rate during the previous 2 millennia. End quote. Moreover, in a 2014 study on tsunamis, Utku Konoglu and co-authors write that, quote, a 1 meter sea level rise and the associated coastal erosion will move coastlines in many highly developed coastal areas hundreds of meters inland, end quote. Kono's poetry collection thus underscores this risk of rising sea levels and the Transpacific path of tsunamis. The collection is based on a series of tsunamis experienced by Kono and her family while growing up in Hilo, located on the island of Hawaii. Vanessa Sim writes that in the Hawaiian archipelago, Hilo is particularly vulnerable to tsunamis, as the, quote, funnel-like underwater shape of Hilo's bayfront amplifies the incoming waves, creating larger heights and stronger inland surges, end quote. Kono's poetry records 3 particularly destructive tsunamis in Hilo, which occurred in 1946, 1957, and 1960, respectively. All 3 of these tsunamis were generated by earthquakes across the Pacific and point to the Trans-Pacific reach of disastrous tsunami waves. The 1946 tsunami, which hit on April Fool's Day, was caused by an earthquake in the Aleutian Islands, resulting in approximately 160 deaths and extensive damage. This damage is depicted in Kono's poem Coral Chips, as the speaker and her family return to their destroyed home in the wake of the tsunami. She writes, quote, we have come back to this place after the disaster. We look for something of our lives. I walk around, pick, then drop pieces of cut glass, a headless doll, a cracked teapot, end quote. Both material and personal damage are palpable here as the speaker sifts through shattered belongings and draws attention to the ways in which the tsunami has erased her family's presence in this space, a point which is tellingly encapsulated in the opening lines, quote, no trace of us, the family who lived there, end quote. When the speaker and her family move to a new rental house, they must once again evacuate during a 1957 tsunami. The University of Southern California's Tsunami Research Group notes that this tsunami, which was generated by an earthquake along the Aleutian Trench, actually had a more destructive impact on the islands of Kauai and Maui. But this tsunami was altogether less devastating than the 1946 one, as, quote, there were no fatalities directly associated with it, end quote. While the waves in Hilo were much smaller than the 1946 waves, the research group points out that, quote, the Hawaiian Islands received advanced warning this time of the approaching tsunami, which provided authorities with sufficient time to spread the warning and evacuate low-lying areas, end quote. This evacuation is depicted in Kono's poem, Hala'i Hill, 1957, as a speaker, her mother, and her sister evacuate their home and drive up the hill after hearing tsunami sirens. Kono writes, quote, I think of our house while we wait, dust coiling in the morning light, our starched school dresses, mother's food-stained uniform on a bamboo rod, a prom lei drying on the wall, crepe paper roses on my desk. Will they be spared? These treasures in our rented house, the X on our coastal inundation map, end quote. These lines in the poem noticeably highlight the vulnerability of the personal objects and routines of daily life in the face of an ever-present risk of disaster. The poem exposes a precarious form of existence, wherein one's life can be literally and figuratively washed away by a looming mark on a tsunami inundation map, and an inundation map that could very well be expanded with the rising tides of climate change. The last tsunami covered in Kono's collection is the 1960 tsunami in Hilo, which was generated by a deadly earthquake in Chile. When the tsunami waves reached Hawaii, they caused the most damage in Hilo Bay. Scientists at the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory assert that it caused 61 deaths in Hilo and destroyed or damaged approximately 520 homes and businesses. The wave heights of both the 1957 tsunami and the more destructive 1960 tsunami are addressed in Kono's poem titled A Spin Around Town. In this poem, the speaker drives with her father around the town of Hilo in the aftermath of both tsunamis. She writes, quote, "Once he took me to the Hukilau Hotel to see the wave heights of the 57 and 60 waves that overflowed the hotel lobby, heights marked on the picture window, with red and blue fluorescent tapes for tourist information. When I was still young, he said that if I kept eating like a bird, I would never grow taller than the 1957 marker, a wave height of 5 feet." End quote. As with the other poems in the collection, the 1957 and 1960 tsunamis are connected to the speaker's childhood and her coming of age. The red and blue tape markings used to measure both past tsunami wave heights and the speaker's own changing height serve as visible tracers or reminders of past disasters. Within our moment of climate change, the tapes hauntingly allude to the disastrous potential of rising sea levels and the possibility that such markers could be raised or moved further inland to record the waves of future tsunamis. Such speculations are similar to Natalie Kopitko's analysis on the projected impact of rising sea levels in her 2015 study, as she writes, quote, "Imagine if the tsunami that struck Fukushima Daiichi had an initial starting point that was 6 feet higher." End quote. Like the global impact of the Mount Pinatubo eruption in the Philippines or the Transpacific path of typhoons, the tsunamis recorded in Kono's poetry collection are also Transpacific entities, wherein earthquakes in Chile and the Aleutian Islands generate tsunami waves that travel throughout the Pacific and its geopolitical borders. Tracing these disparate disasters together reveals a Transpacific geography of climate change, one reaffirmed by the 2014 IPCC synthesis report, which states that, quote, "Climate change has the characteristics of a collective action problem at the global scale because most greenhouse gases accumulate over time and mix globally, and emissions by any agent affect other agents," end quote. It is my hope that using a Transpacific network of disaster and literary analysis will help to draw attention to differing vulnerabilities across the Pacific and highlight the need for a global approach to climate change that accounts for its processes and circulations across national borders. Thank you for listening to my talk.